Earlier this year, the queer community in Botswana actually celebrated a High Court decision where a full bench unanimously found that the criminalisation of consensual same-sex relationships violates the Constitution. And tomorrow, the Botswana Court of Appeal will issue a judgment on this case, which has the support from the Southern Africa Litigation Centre, who are admitted as amicus curiae. To tell us a bit more about this case, help us place its significance, let's bring in Anneke Meerkotter, who's the Executive Director for the Southern Africa Litigation Centre. She joins us now from Botswana via our video link, and it's great to have you on the program. Thank you so much for making time. As always, shall we begin with much needed context? It was back in 2019 where Botswana essentially decriminalized gay sex. It appears there's a move now from the government to reverse that decision. Tell us why.
Good morning, Ayanda. Yes, let me start with the context. So you're correct. In 2019, the Botswana High Court decriminalized sex between same-sex partners. This was celebrated as quite a huge victory within the LGBT community and more broadly in Africa. It was a very recent decision, and it really looked at giving everyone the same rights and entitlements in the Constitution. And it clearly found that if you prohibit sex between people simply because they are from the same sex, that is such a violation of their right to equality, their right to privacy, their right to dignity. So this was a huge step for the Botswana High Court. The state appealed it, and just in context, the state generally appeals big decisions like that to the Court of Appeal because it feels that it is better that a decision from the higher court actually creates clarity on the situation. So it's not necessarily bad that they appealed, and it doesn't necessarily indicate what their position is. Although the Attorney General, when they argued the case, seemed to be saying that this is really a decision that should be lying with Parliament and not with the judiciary. Yeah. So in October we had the hearing before the full bench of the Court of Appeal, and because of COVID, it was live streamed. There was also the court was also open to two big courts so the LGBT community can attend, and I think this was also quite monumental. Yeah, so that's sort of where we're coming from. So if we get the judgment tomorrow, this will have repercussions, I think, in many other courts in Africa who are deciding similar cases or might similar cases in the future, especially because the Botswana court's decisions are quite highly valued. They're very reasonable. The court is seen as not pandering to any sort of outside influences or politics and those sort of things. So we can expect a very well-reasoned judgment tomorrow.
Sure. Interesting to see what the state is arguing in some respects. From what I've been able to read up upon, part of what the state is saying is that there's no proof in society that perceptions or attitudes around homosexuality have actually changed. And it's on that basis that the court, as far as the state is concerned, has erred by decriminalizing homosexuality to begin with. But surely it's more than just what people feel and think in society, especially for an issue to do with human rights.
Absolutely. There's two points to it. The one is that attitudes have in fact changed. There was an Afrobarometer survey done immediately after the 2019 High Court, which said that it asked people how they would feel about having a gay neighbor. And tolerance levels actually increased by 10% immediately following the judgment, which then begs the question whether attitudes aren't themselves informed by the laws in place, because the laws create a sense of norms. So it then becomes quite a circular argument what public attitude is, because it might well be that public attitude is what it is because of the laws that are there in the first place. So that's the one point. And the other point is that you're absolutely right. Public attitude ought not to matter. The High Court was very clear on this, and the Court of Appeal has been clear on this in similar LGBT-related issues, to say that the whole purpose of the court and how the Constitution is set up in most African countries is that the court is there to protect people's constitutional rights and recognizes that in some instances this would be minority groups who can't actually have their rights protected through Parliament or any other avenue. And that's why people are able to go to the courts to assert their constitutional rights in the first place.
Right. What is interesting is the discussions that are taking place outside of the judiciary and in activist spaces. For instance, I wonder what the scope of this case will be, because in religious sectors, for instance, whether it's Christianity or Islam, you find that there's talk of homosexual acts, in other words, gay sex in some respects, and homosexuality, which is, for lack of a better term, the disposition that anybody might have. Does this case cover both aspects, do you feel, or is more focused on this act, however you want to describe that, by the way?
Sure. You're absolutely right, and I think terminology is a big issue in how we define things. So in Botswana, there's actually been a concerted effort by activists through the courts to actually try and change. So previously, the organization which SALC is partnering with, LeGaBiBo, Lesbians, Gays and Bisexuals of Botswana, they were previously refused registration simply because their members were gay and according to the state might committed crimes. And then the courts, both the High Court and the Court of Appeal, was very clear to say that it is not a crime to be gay. It's not a crime to be homosexual or anything like that. What is prohibited in the penal code is a specific sexual act. And it doesn't take away the rights of people in any other sphere of life, and they have exactly the same rights as everyone else. So the Botswana courts have already established that, which is why you also then see an improvement in attitudes and access to services and those sort of things in Botswana. So this case then really comes to the last hurdle of also then trying to decriminalize the actual act of having sex with a partner of your choice.
Let's better place what's at stake here. Before the decriminalization of homosexuality, I understand that gay sex, for lack of a better term, could be punishable by up to 7 years behind bars. If government has its way tomorrow, if the judgment, in fact, is delivered tomorrow, do you get the sense that that kind of sanction would be reinstated?
So the sanction has been there in the penal code for as long as since the colonial era. It hasn't actually been enforced in Botswana that much. The previous conviction we saw, which had then led to a similar case to this one, was 20 years ago. In that instance, the Court of Appeal had said that public opinion means that the society is not yet ready to allow same-sex couples the same rights as anyone else. I think a lot has changed since then. I don't think the government is going to start actively using the offence even if they win tomorrow. I think what it would more indicate is that they would then... It's not really about state, I think, opposing it. The Botswana government has in many documents actually been favorable to LGBTQI rights. And there's been a number of recent reports where they've been lauded for working so closely with the LGBT community to try and ensure access to health services and those type of things. So I think it's not necessarily about persecution in Botswana, but the trend it sets is important because there is a lot of persecution and arrests of people throughout the continent, and changing that sort of discourse through a judgment like this would be very important.
Absolutely. Thanks for helping us place the significance of the story. I really appreciate your time on the Weekend Report today. Anneke Meerkotter is the Executive Director of the Southern Africa Litigation Centre. They are admitted as friends of the court in this appeal. Once again, thanks very much indeed.